energy. Life is the interaction of magnetic vibrational fields that run through everything. Earth has a magnetic field, so does the human body. Change the magnetism in one and you change the nature of the energy field. Change the energy field and you change the nature of mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical life, all of which energy in different forms and may even be dimensions. The research of today's guest, Maurice Cotterell, established that the sun is the great mediator of life on the Earth grid and our planet's magnetic field. Is it our great initiator? Maurice has made a long and detailed study of sunspot and solar flare activity when the sun is projecting immensely powerful magnetic energy. This has been photographed as gigantic loops of fire, some 100,000 miles high. This energy travels to the Earth on the solar wind, and it can affect computer systems and cause power blackouts and give you a really bad hair day. But for the Van Allen belts, the zones of radiation that surround and protect our planet and connect with the Earth's magnetic field, the sun's energy would literally fry us. In his latest book, Jesus, King Arthur, and the Journey of the Grail, Maurice has discovered that the super science of the sun and the higher orders of spirituality are concealed and contained in the story of the Holy Grail. Did the Grail stories leave a cryptic message to warn us of a future solar event, a catastrophe when energy surges hit the Earth and pile drive our planet? Do the Grail stories point toward the means to elevate our consciousness, to a means to serve or surf the sun? Just who or what does the Grail serve? Let's ask Maurice Cotterell. Maurice, welcome to Dreamland. Okay. You know, one of the main subjects that we discuss here on Dreamland is change, and it appears our civilization is at a crossroads. We are an unknown country, and something very significant and even wonderful appears to be on the verge of manifesting. Is this a view that you share?
Well, it's difficult to see the wood for the trees sometimes, William, in any situation. And there is no conclusive data right now, for example, that we are nearing any catastrophic period such as has been recorded geologically and in other ways in the past. Clearly, there are prophecies from ancient sun-worshipping civilizations like the Mayas and many of the other sun-worshipping civilizations that I've studied. For example, that of Tutankhamun in Egypt, that was a sun-worshipping civilization. The Viracochas in Peru, again, they worship the sun. The ancient Chinese of the first emperor, around the time of the first emperor, about 220 BC, he too worshipped the sun. And of course, the Celtic people, they were sun worshippers. And what I've discovered during my research is that each of these civilizations understood what I call the super science of the sun, that is, how the sun affects life on Earth. And they went beyond the scientific understanding into a spiritual understanding, which really transcended our own understanding of life today. It was, for example, people have said to me very often, is there a catastrophe forecast in the near future which is going to bring doom to the Earth? And if there is, why didn't the Mayans, for example, try to stop it or escape or whatever? And I tried to explain to them that they realize the higher orders of spirituality, that is, that this life is only transient and brief, these 70 years that we experience here, and that the next life could be everlasting, and there was no point in trying to escape it, because this is such a small part of existence. What is really important is what comes after, not any possible physical catastrophe that might befall mankind in the near future. So, as for the actual question of can we predict anything in the near future, clearly no. But catastrophes have happened in the past. They are recorded in the tree rings of trees, the bristlecone pine, for example, which absorbs carbon-14 over cyclical periods. We know that catastrophes and mini ice ages have frequented Earth. It looks like the Earth has tilted on its planet in the past. Again, all due to solar variations in the solar radiation coming off the sun. And this is why these ancient sun-worshipping civilizations worship the sun, because they understood the profound effect the sun plays in our everyday lives. For example, they knew that the sun spins on its axis every 28 days, and that this radiation travels to the Earth, bombards the Van Allen belts that surround us and protect the Earth from radiation, and convert the particle bombardment into a magnetic variations on the Earth's surface. And we now know that those magnetic variations affect the hypothalamus and pineal gland in the brain, and in so doing they affect the production of the timing hormone, melatonin, and that in turn affects the production of the follicle-stimulating hormone, and of course estrogen and progesterone, the fertility hormones. And so we now know that the 28-day spinning sun regulates the menstrual cycle in females. Now, ancient civilizations understood this process thousands of years ago, and this demonstrates just how far advanced they were then to what we are today. And this is just one effect of solar radiation. There are many other effects of solar radiation, from causing cancer to causing spontaneous fetal abortion and miscarriage. When we have sunspot maximums, periods of high sunspot activity on the solar surface. Pole tilts, if the sun's magnetic field twists and changes direction, it can tilt the planets in our solar system off their axes. And again, all of this knowledge was known by these ancient civilizations. And as you know, I've written a series of books over the years which looked at the Mayan civilization first, that was in 1995, then the super gods in 1997. Now, this was a little bit of a departure from the actual looking at how the sun affected Earth. When I was working on the Mayan prophecies in 1995, I came to the conclusion that this civilization must have had either a super teacher from whom they received all of their super knowledge, or there was some other mechanism whereby they could have absorbed this knowledge which we are only coming to terms with ourselves today. And as I looked into it more and more, it seemed that they did in fact have a super teacher who was known to them as Lord Paikal, a priest-king leader who taught them everything they needed to know. A few years later, when I looked at the Tutankhamun prophecies, the sun-worshipping civilization of Tutankhamun in Egypt, from around 1350 BC, I began to notice similarities between the Mayan civilization and that of Tutankhamun. For example, Lord Paikal was known as the feathered snake to his people, ostensibly because the feathered eagle represented the spirit in the heavens, and the snake represented the body on earth that shed its skin periodically, reincarnated from time to time. And of course Tutankhamun carried the eagle or the vulture and the snake on his forehead. And as I started to learn more and more about these leaders, they shared an awful lot in common. They both took to the throne at 9 years old. They were both born through an immaculate conception. If we have a look at the treasures from the tombs of these two leaders, we notice that they were born through an immaculate conception. But when they lived, they performed miracles, and when they died, they became the planet Venus. Now, planet Venus, from all ancient sun-worshipping civilizations, regarded their leaders as Venus because it's the brightest, purest source of light in the heavens. So it's associated with spiritual leadership. And the more I looked into the sun-worshipping civilizations, it became clear that each of the world's religions was started by what I call a super god, somebody who understood the super science of the sun and the higher orders of spirituality. And they periodically come to Earth, and the story is the same every time. They're born, when they're born, a bright star is seen in the sky. They're born through an immaculate conception. When they're alive, they perform miracles. When they die, they go to heaven and become the planet Venus. And when I looked at the civilizations of Peru and China and even the Celtic people, the same story comes through every time. And it became clear that it's the same spiritual energy that's reincarnating from age to age, telling us about how the sun affects life on Earth. And
that's very interesting that you would describe this super god as an energy or a vibration. We're going to be talking about the Holy Grail in a moment. And I'm wondering if you've looked at the inscription upon the cross in Christian tradition. According to the Bible, Pilate placed a plaque inscribed INRI, INRI, which is thought to mean Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews, and was intended both to state his crime and also to mock him. How dare he proclaim himself the King of the Jews? But esoterically, INRI has been interpreted as meaning by fire, frequency, or vibration, humanity is renewed whole. So could you talk for us a moment, please, Maurice, about how these figures, you've mentioned Pakal, Tutankhamun, Jesus, came to embody this vibration of the super god?
Oh, it's rather a long question, William. How did they take on bodily form? Well, clearly that was preordained by the creator of the universe. And when I look at that in scientific terms, if we look at the scriptures, it tells us that God is light, and light, as we know today, is an electromagnetic vibration. It's light. And if we look at all of the scriptures from each of the world's religions in turn, they all seem to agree that in the beginning there was light. Then we're told that God created the planets and the solar system and the physical universe. And modern science tells us that this happened through what we now know as the Big Bang. If we look at Einstein's theory of relativity, Einstein gave us the equation energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. And basically what we're saying is, in the beginning there was light, that's energy, on one side of Einstein's equation. But then a few moments later, when the universe began, God must have sacrificed and converted some of his energy, his electromagnetic energy, into mass. In other words, it went across the equation, and we had the Big Bang. So on the one side of the equation we've got energy, and now when God sacrificed himself, we arrive at the other side of the equation, which is mass. Now, of course, when energy goes across this algebraic formula, it must change its sign. In other words, if something is positive on one side of an equation, high school algebra tells us that when it goes to the other side, it becomes negative. And this is very important because what it tells us is that mass is the opposite charge to energy. Now, if God is the energy, everything in the physical universe, therefore, using this logic, must be hell. In other words, the physical universe as we know it is hell. Now, the religions tell us that the human body is comprised of body and soul. And if we live a good life, we purify the soul can increase in voltage, and it goes to heaven, which is where we came from. It goes back to God. Now, of course, what we understand from Einstein, or what we learn from Einstein's equation, is that given that this is hell, then good souls go to heaven, but bad souls go to hell. And what that really means is bad souls come back to the physical universe.
This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. Subscribers, you have a must-listen-to interview coming up between Whitley Strieber and Maurice Cotterell, going into more detail about Maurice's extensive knowledge about sunspot activity and the influence of the sun on human life. Maurice, in your book, you note that Jesus taught that the hidden purpose of life on earth was to purify the heart. You write, a pure heart purifies the soul, and a pure soul goes to heaven to experience peace, joy, and bliss with the Creator. And the way to a pure heart was through love, sacrifice, and suffering. How did the early sun worshippers achieve this state of pureness and bliss within their heart?
Again, the way to purity, or purification of the spirit, William, is through loving our neighbour. This is what the Bible tells us, love your neighbour. It's quite a straightforward process. It's a bit like look after the pennies and the pounds look after themselves. And if we love each other, then it seems that what happens is that the spiritual energy inside each person, I need to go back slightly because it's very straightforward, but if we start to miss parts of the story, it can get confusing. What happens is we are biological entities and spiritual entities. What this means is that we are chromosomes which are made of atoms. And when we're formed in the womb, the cells start to organize themselves and systems develop in the fetus. And the systems, for example, the circulatory system starts to drive blood around the developing fetus. And the fetus starts to develop a brain. And we start to get electrical currents flowing through the body and electrical voltages in the body. Now, what we heard just a few moments ago was that everything in the physical world is the opposite of God. So let's say, for example, that the developing fetus has a biological voltage of -5 volts, for example, just by way of example. As the fetus develops in the womb, that -5 volts attracts another 5 volts positive from God, who is all around us in the heavens, this positive energy that we call light. So positive God attaches to the negative biological body of the fetus developing, and the fetus now becomes a human being. Its -5 volts body is attached to a +5 volts bubble of godly energy. Now, the baby will be delivered from the womb, and it will grow up as a human being, and the human being will have 4 different bodies. It's not just a physical entity. It's not just a physical body. We've also got an intellectual body. These are the ideas we have. We have an emotional body. This is the heart. And we have a spiritual body, which is the energy field around us. And these 4 different bodies exist in different dimensions with different rules. For example, in the physical world, if I have $1 and you have $1 and we exchange them, we finish up with $1 each. But in the intellectual world, if I have an idea and you have an idea and we exchange them, and we finish up with 2 ideas each, we can double our intellectual wealth at no cost. Now, it seems that in the emotional world, if I love you, then my soul voltage increases. And if my soul voltage increases, then when my body dies and the soul is released, my soul goes back to heaven where it came from. My higher voltage soul, for example, has risen from 5 volts where it started off into perhaps 10 volts. So it has the energy to escape the Earth's gravitational field and go back to the heavens and go back and become God. That's how it started off. What this means, of course, is that God has grown. And so mankind can be seen as a purification conduit that permits godly growth. So the universe expands. So godly energy expands, and the physical universe expands to accommodate the Einstein E=mc² equation.
The challenge that many of us have today, though, Maurice, is that we are subjected to forms of emotional and mental anguish, such as depression, anxiety, fatigue, rage, bewilderment. How does this impact our quest to achieve this voltage or to ignite this divine spark within us? How do we overcome the challenges of our civilization?
Well, the challenges are a result of the physical universe. Just going back, as we said earlier, the physical universe is hell. So we are in hell. This is why we're having these challenges. This is why no matter what we do, it turns out pear-shaped. And these are the rules of the physical universe. This is the way God designed the physical universe, so that we could purify our souls. If everything was wonderful, then we wouldn't suffer. But suffering causes searching in the mind. Searching of the mind causes wrestling in the heart. And wrestling of the heart purges it of impurity, as the wringing of a wet rag purges it of water. And a pure heart, then, can drain the soul of impurity. And this is, we've all been born many, many times before. Our soul goes from incarnation to incarnation. The problem is when we reincarnate and come back to Earth, we get a new mind with a new memory, so we don't remember anything from the past life, and we get a new heart with no emotional memory, so we can't remember the emotional things from our previous emotional life. So we have to start off again, and we're taught in the Bible that the first will be last and the last will be first. What this means is the rich come back as poor, the poor as rich. Men come back as women, women as men. Fat people as thin people as fat people. There appears to be an inverse process of soul transmigration. And this is all part of the story, if you like, the purification story. It's very, very difficult to get to heaven. Only those who are very rich, who give all their money away, will get to heaven. This is what we've been told. It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to get to the kingdom of heaven. We have to love our neighbor because our neighbor is ourself. This is what the Maya believed. I am you and you are me. And it's only when we start to love each other unequivocally that we realize that our soul purifies and we go back to heaven. We're all the same godly energy. We're only disguised as a physical being at this time.
So in this way, depression, anxiety, phobias, addictions, all of these challenges are really not challenges at all. These are sort of gifts that enable us to bring them up for purification. But yet you seem to be saying that all of this is somehow directly related to the sun. Am I hearing you correctly? How is this related to the sun, and are we in a changing environment where we might expect to see an increase in these challenges and therefore an increase or a better opportunity to cleanse and purify ourselves?
There doesn't seem to be any evidence to suggest that the sun's radiation is going to change any emotional and intellectual or physical or spiritual conditions on Earth at this time. We have to take a macro view, a larger view. Now, the Egyptians believed that the Milky Way was the seed ground of souls, and the Egyptians believed that we could become a star. If our voltage was great enough, we become a star in the sky. And that suggests that our own star is a god, it's a living thing, and that we are just like insects, if you like, that can increase their soul voltage to a particular level to seed the universe as new stars. So this is at the beginning of the purification process now. As human beings on Earth, we start out in an evolutionary stairway. In other words, we start out as single-cell creatures like amoeba, then we get to more complex creatures like Spirogyra, multicellular organisms. Then we became shellfish and armored fish and then dragonflies. And as the voltage of these entities increased, it was at the stage of chimpanzee or ape, if you like, that the systems were sufficiently the voltage of the entity was sufficient to drag bubbles of energy off God to give us this divine nature. So it's only at a certain level of our evolution, after thousands and thousands of years, that we started to acquire souls from heaven. And so we're half God. As Jesus said, your body is a temple of God. God is inside us. We are half God and half devil. The body is the devil. The soul attached the body is pure godly energy. Now, when we walk down the street and we see an attractive member of the opposite sex and we have bad thoughts, that's the body. The devil is having the bad thoughts, not the God. The God then steps in and says, well, hang on a second. I don't recommend that you allow your bad thoughts to be fulfilled, because it will get you into all sorts of trouble. So we begin this intellectual challenge between the black and the white within us. And we have to overcome the darkness within us by generating the light within us to crowd out the darkness. If we are filled with light, we can't be filled with darkness. So if we start asking the question, is our vibration about to change? Well, in the short-term view, there's no point in looking at 50 years or thousands of years. We're talking about millions and millions and millions of years. If our voltage goes up, we will become a star. If it goes down, we will become a pig or a flower or an oak tree. And forever and ever, it's like each incarnation on Earth is like being in an elevator in a high-rise apartment block. The first life, we might be born at 5 volts, and we come back, perhaps for a good soul, we don't go to heaven. Good heavens, you have to be 1,000 volts to get to heaven. We then go up to 10 volts in the next lifetime. And we will come back richer than the lifetime before, because we've been good in the previous life. But if we come back as a rich person, we fail to accept and appreciate how other people suffer. So in the third lifetime, we go down again to 2 volts. When we come back in a 2-volt body, it's a bad body. We don't come back wealthy. We come back poor, and we're enslaved. And during the period of enslavement, in that particular incarnation, our intellect starts to improve, because we start to question why we're treated so badly, and our voltage goes up again, maybe to 15 volts. So it's like being in an elevator going up and down in a tall building forever and ever. And it's only when we can give away all our money and purify ourselves spiritually that we can get to the roof of the building where the helicopter awaits to take us to heaven. And this is the dilemma. Because we have a new heart and a new brain in each incarnation, we don't know about this process of iterative spiritual development, up and down, up and down, up and down, from lifetime to lifetime. And this is why the Peruvians, for example, married their sisters, so that if they didn't get to heaven, the Peruvian kings knew they would come back to the same DNA, and they would come back as a member of the royal family, as a prince or a princess. And this is why the Egyptians preserved their intestines and their liver and their lungs, but they didn't preserve the heart and the brain, because they were trying to tell us, look, if you do reincarnate, and if you do come back to this body which has been preserved as a mummy, for example, if that were possible, it would be no good to you, because you wouldn't remember the previous incarnation and what you did and why you are here doing the things you are doing today. And it's this is why the ancient civilizations wrote the knowledge down in all of their monuments. The Mayas, the Egyptians, the Peruvians, the Chinese, and the Celtic people, the Celts wrote it down in their Holy Grail. Jesus came and gave us the same knowledge. And they were saying, look, you won't be able to figure this stuff out easily. It's very, very difficult. It takes millions and millions of years for you to realize that you're half God and half devil. And it'll take you millions of years to realize this process of purification. So we are writing the knowledge down for you to give you a head start so that you can purify your soul in this incarnation. Thereby, you won't come back to this hell again. You will escape this prison camp. You will escape this hell if you look at this knowledge which we've left behind for you and understand what we're trying to teach you, that you really can become a god in the heaven.
And so, have you seen evidence in our contemporary civilization that people are actually utilizing this knowledge? Are there mystery schools that you're aware of, or others that are on top of this understanding? I mean, this is obviously pure Gnosticism that you're describing here, and we know that throughout the centuries that much of this knowledge has been concealed. It's been taken by various religious and political regimes that seek to keep us enslaved, reincarcerated in this prison hell, as you describe it. So where can we look today for examples of this knowledge?
There are lots of esoteric orders and societies who have been trying to regain the knowledge they had thousands of years ago. For example, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, the Church, and all of the knowledge goes back to when man first appeared on the earth in this present solar cycle. We're looking at the Egyptian civilization going back to 3,500 BC. We're looking at 5,500 years ago.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Maurice Cotterell. Listeners, please get over to the subscriber section and listen to Whitley's fascinating conversation with Maurice. As you can tell, he's got enormous knowledge that he's willing to share with us, and I can assure you Whitley will bring out even more fascinating material. Maurice, there's some incredible information in your book concerning 4,000-year-old mummies of tall white men and women with blonde hair that were discovered in China. I'd like to talk about this discovery and ask you a question that relates to the initiators of Tutankhamun. There are some believe that Tutankhamun's initiator, as well as Akhenaten's, came from Central Asia. So tell us about this discovery of these mummies and how these ancient tall whites might have played a role in some of the ancient civilizations.
Yes, in 1994, news started to reach the West of some mummies that had been discovered in the Taklamakan Desert. And these were tall Caucasian mummies, some 6 feet tall, men, women, and children. And even the children had blue lapis lazuli stones over their eyes, over their eyelids. They were perfectly preserved in the dry deserts of Taklamakan, which is in northwest China. And this absolutely baffled modern science. They couldn't understand how these people got there, how they acquired their knowledge of spinning and weaving, because they were found wearing tartan fabrics and shawls made from felt and so on. And it now looks that these mummies first appeared in the Taklamakan Desert about 4,000 years ago. Even today, we're not sure where they first appeared on Earth. Of course, just to digress slightly, there are two competing schools at the moment. We have, in regard to the ascension of man, the ascent of man, I should say, on Earth, the evolution of man. One subscribes to the Darwinian theory, which says that we are an accident of time, a biological accident, and we've come together through a chemical soup on Earth that was acted upon by electrical charges and lightning and so on to produce the first living organisms. And other schools, the creationists, favour the view that God made the world in 7 days. Now, that might be a simplistic view, but of course the Bible goes into a lot more detail than that. What neither school seems to appreciate is that we've moved on since Darwin, the 19th century biologist. And sadly, a few of the modern-day scientists realise that we've actually moved on in the last 200 years. We now understand, for example, since the Second World War, that when we bombard living cells with X-rays, then we get genetic mutations. So it's a perfectly feasible genetic mutational argument or perspective to appreciate that there may have been bursts of X-rays from the sun which mutated certain species in one mutational leap rather than gradually and incrementally as the evolutionists claim. In other words, they're not recognizing that mankind may have been created when 5 different types of gorilla or chimpanzee or ape were mutated by bursts of X-rays, causing them to become men overnight in the wombs of their biological hosts. Now, getting back to the mummies at Taklamakan, how did they get there? You know, there are all sorts of possibilities. If we look at it's not so much, we can only go back so far with the knowledge we've got, and we must assume that they evolved from primates into mankind, either slowly, as the evolutionists claim, or they came in a mutational leap for a burst of X-rays or gamma rays released from the sun, or perhaps some nuclear activity that happened on the Earth. Now, once the mummies are there, they started to migrate, and it looks like this was the origin of the Celtic people. When I started to look into how the Irish people found themselves in Ireland, it seems that there were 2 incursions, or actually 3, one around the time of Stonehenge, around 3113 BC, which led to an influx of settlers from mainland Europe to settle in Ireland, creating the monumental Newgrange, and also in England at the same time to create Stonehenge, that's Stonehenge 1. Of course, there was Stonehenge 2 1,000 years later, and Stonehenge 3 with the stone circles 1,000 years after that. So we had the megalithic monument builders arriving in the British Isles around 3000 BC. We then had an influx. If we look at the in Annals of Inishforlan, which is the chronicles from a monastery in Ireland, in County Kerry. There was a monastery there from about 620 onwards, AD 620. The annals were compiled elsewhere at another monastery in Lismore. But the accounts of the annals tell us that a burst of migration took place from Scythia, which was north of the Black Sea. And the account in the Annals of Inishforlan says that a leader named Mill fled from Scythia in about 1500 BC after trying to have a political coup and kill his brother. And he left Scythia with his black-haired brethren, and he sailed with 4 boatloads of people, married couples, and they went to Egypt, where they stayed for about 3 years. Mill married the pharaoh's daughter, called Scota, and then they all left. They emigrated from Egypt and went to live in Spain. And when they were living in Spain, Mill and Scota had 4 sons, Eriman, Don, Aya, and Aber, and another son whose name is actually, unfortunately, missing from the annals. Now, this was the origin of the black-haired Irish, because this group of settlers then moved on to Ireland, and it was the son of Mill, Aya, who the land of Ireland was named after. And after that, the sons of Scota, the pharaoh's daughter, left Northern Ireland and sailed to Scotland to create the Scota, the tribe of the Scots. And this is where the tartan fabrics came from. So if we go all the way back to the Taklamakan desert and watch the migration of, we have 2 groups of people. The first group is the Scythians, who have straight black hair, They left Scythia about 1500 BC, migrated across Europe from Egypt, Spain, via sea to Ireland, and the nation of Ireland was born. We then have another influx happening simultaneously 4,000 years ago, 500 years just before Mill leaves Scythia. He knew the ginger-haired blondes, the tartan-clad ginger-haired blondes, moved from the Taklamakan Desert through the northern steppe lands, the grasslands of Europe and Eurasia, through Germany as the Celts. They become the Celtic people. They spread out about 800 BC throughout Europe. And they moved to Ireland. And it's in Ireland that we find the golden treasures of the Celts, the early Celts, which show the sun radiating its energy and how the sun affects life on Earth.
See, this is what's so interesting to me, because the early Egyptians, especially around the reign of Tutmosis III, who was the grandfather of Akhenaten, of course, related to Tutankhamun, they talk about this figure named Amenhotep, son of Hapu, who came out of likely Central Asia. And what I'm wondering here is if it is indeed possible that this perhaps even this Aryan race that you're describing, whose mummies they discovered here recently in Central Asia, were the initiators of the Atan religion. And isn't it interesting that the Egyptian Atan, the Hebrew Adon, which means Lord and Light, the Aryan Odin are basically the same word. And then, of course, you've talked about Votan, the Mayan magician of time. It just seems like it's just kind of pointing back to this notion that there is this secret society that we've alluded to a moment ago that came out of this region and brought this knowledge of sun worship to the world. What are your thoughts on that possibility?
Absolutely. But it doesn't explain, for example, what we're suggesting is that there is a common origin to all of this super knowledge and the esoteric knowledge, which is fine. I can go along with that biologically. However, there are problems. For example, Tutankhamun, his body was found in a tomb in Egypt, and he taught the super science of the sun. Lord Paykal's body was found at Palenque in Mexico. He taught the super science of the sun 2,000 years after Tutankhamun. We have the Viracochas, the two white, tall men who walked the lands of Peru, performing miracles around AD 300 and AD 500. Their bodies were found in tombs off the northwest coast of Saipan. Now, it couldn't have been the same guy taking a boat, teaching all these various civilizations about all of this information, this super knowledge. Now, if it's not the same guy, given that they're all leaving the same message, it must be the same spiritual energy. In other words, what I've suggested throughout my books is that the god Krishna, which is Greek for the anointed one, he reincarnated, so the Hindu people believe, 9 times. The 8th time was Buddha. And Buddha's mother's name was called Maya, which means illusion. And Tutankhamun's wet nurse was called Maya. And the architect of Tutankhamun's tomb was Maya. Lord Paykal was the leader of the Mayas in Mexico. And we find all these common threads between them. As we progress chronologically, we go from Buddha around 550 BC, and we come up against Qin Shi Huangdi, 220 BC, who I believe was another super god. He was known as the son of heaven. So was Tutankhamun, Tutankhamun, the living image of God. Now, the living image of anybody is their son or offspring. So this tells us Tutankhamun is a living image of God, the Son of God. Then we have Jesus, which is Chi. In the Bible, the angel comes to Mary and says, "You will give birth to a baby, and his name will be Jesus," or Chi Zeus. Now, Chi is angelic vibration in Tibetan. It's godly energy. And Zeus at the time was the highest of gods in the Mediterranean. So again, we have Chi Zeus, the Son of God. Jesus, or Christos, Christ, the Anointed One, the same as Krishna. Christ died on the cross at Easter. The Catholic word for Easter is Pascal. Lord Pakal was the leader of the Mayas. When we start to decode the treasures in the tomb of Lord Pakal, They tell us that Lord Pekal was born in a stable, that when he grew up he performed miracles. He died on a cross made of 2 pieces of wood, and he became the planet Venus. When we read the Bible, the last page of Revelation in the Bible says, I am the bright and morning star. I am the twin star Venus. So again, we have all of these links through all of these leaders of these civilizations, the sun-worshipping civilizations, which come to Earth at 1,000 years intervals between them, from Krishna at 2750 BC to Tutankhamun 1353, Buddha at 550 BC, Chinchi Huangdi 220 BC, Jesus at 0 BC AD, and there is no periodic time interval. Then we have the Viracochas. Viracocha was the perfect being. Viracocha in the language of the Quechua of Peru means the perfect being, because it means the crab, the foam of the sea, and it's represented by the crab because the perfect being is in harmony with all of the elements, just like crab, which lives in the foam of the sea, the earth, the air, the fire, the water. If we move towards the land, we lose contact with one of the elements, the water. If we move towards the water, then of course we'd lose contact with the land. So it's only when we're in the foam of the sea that we're perfect, and that's Viracocha. And this is why the Hindus represented heaven as the milky ocean. It was the milk in the ocean, the foam of the sea. And this is why the Hindus worship the cow. They believe the cow to be sacred because it provides the milk, which is heaven. And if we carry on, excuse me, in Peru, we move from Viracocha and Viracocha Pachacamac. In fact, it was Viracocha Pachacamac, the god of the world, who arrived in AD 300, and Viracocha, who arrived in AD 500 in Peru. So we have 2 Viracochas. And the stories of the Incas tell us that these 2 white men, they created the earth, they created the lines of Nazca, they drew the animals on Nazca, they drew the feathered snakes on Nazca, the eagles with the long feathered snake necks, just like Tutankhamun was the feathered snake, just like Lord Pekal was the feathered snake. And what we find is that they were also represented by the stag. They all shared something in common. That was the stag. And that's because the stag sheds its horns or its antlers every year. And the earth goes around the sun every year. So we have an association with antlers and with God and the sun. And this is why the Celtic god Cernunnos is shown wearing the antlers, because he's associated as the son of God, as light on the earth, as an incarnation of God, the creator of the universe. So again, it's all very well to say, well, biologically, did these people all come from the Taklamakan Desert, spread out? Did they become the Egyptians and later on the Mayans and so on? But the fact that there are bodies all over the globe and they were all buried at different times, and that the messages left behind were exactly the same, super scientific and higher spiritual understanding, then we must understand that we have to think out of the box and say, well, okay, if it wasn't the same body, how on earth could the same message keep coming to Earth on so many occasions? And the only way that can be is that the same spiritual energy takes on bodily form from time to time and leaves exactly the same message behind. And they leave the messages behind in their treasures to tell us about how to get to heaven, and they tell us using pictures and using numbers. They don't tell us using language, because after thousands of years, when civilizations disappear and we reincarnate, it's no good using a written language. We've got to use pictures that we understand and numbers, because we always count to 10 with our fingers. So we all have a common denominator of the base 10 system. And this is why they use numbers in the Bible. For example, 666, 144,000. And they also encoded information using astronomical variables that would subsist over enormous periods of time. For example, all of the tombs contain the number 26 and 28, the revolutionary period of the sun as it spins on its axis on the surface of the sun, or as it is seen from Earth, 26 days on the sun, 28 days from the Earth. Also, the revolution of the sun's polar caps, which rotate more slowly, 37 and 41 from Earth. They contain the same massive periods, historical periods, of 1,366,040, 1366040. Again, they encoded the same numbers to tell us that the sun's magnetic field would change periodically after given periods of time, bringing catastrophic destruction to the planet Earth. And of course, the next period of destruction, by my calculations, is not until about the year 4600 AD. So it is not in the imminent future. So,
well, that's a relief. I mean, the book of Isaiah predicts then that the sun and the moon will brighten sevenfold when the Christos returns, and it's kind of interesting. Isaiah says this will occur when the towers fall, and it makes you wonder if the towers of 9/11 might be the towers of reference. But you're saying it's still at least 2,500 years in the future before we will experience such a change in the sun's intensity.
Yes, if you work out the figures that they left behind us from all of these sun-worshipping civilizations, they tell us that the sun's magnetic field last changed in the year 3113 BC, which is the beginning of our current cosmic era. And that's when the Mayan cycle begins. That's a bit unusual because the Mayas didn't appear on Earth until about AD 100 at Teotihuacan. And they died out in about AD 750 in the Yucatan Peninsula, which raises the question, why would any civilization worship a calendar that began 3,200 years before they even got here? And of course they realized that that was the beginning of a cosmic era. At that time, the sun's magnetic field twisted, went from northeast to southwest. And what happened then was that the planets in the solar system had a propensity to twist off their axis. Now, Venus being closest to the Earth on that occasion, it appears that Venus twisted on its axis at that time, and now Venus spins upside down. It spins in the opposite way to all of the other planets in the solar system. And the Mayas referred to that date in antiquity as the birth date of Venus. Now, they tell us that it would happen again in 627 AD, and my work, the Mayan prophecies, shows that it did in fact happen again in AD 623, but that the magnetic twist wasn't strong enough on that occasion to turn any of the planets upside down. But what did happen was we had a period of infertility, which is associated with a reduction in solar radiation. That meant babies died. At the same time, we had a mini ice age, again associated with a sunspot minimum, which meant we had drought, which affected equatorial regions more than other regions in northern and southern latitudes. And we also had a bombardment of X-rays, causing an increase in spontaneous fetal abortion. So all of these problems caused the demise of the Maya to such an extent that they almost disappeared. Although we all suffered in northern and southern latitudes, we didn't to such the same extent. So if we work out the figures that they left behind, then from 627 AD, we won't have another magnetic reversal until 3,700 years after that period, which will be about, as I say, about 4,600 AD. So there's no reason at this, using our current level of understanding and the current scientific knowledge. But of course, what we learned from the Mayas, who encoded their information in moving video pictures and photographs, what we learn from this incredibly super intelligent civilization is that they were cleverer than we are. And they did make prophecies to say that catastrophe would frequent Earth in 2012. Now, I would err on the side of caution, given that they were so much more advanced than we are. And it might suggest that they were in possession of facts which have yet to come to mind to our own scientific community. For example, they may realize, or have realized, that if the planets do not tilt off their axis when a magnetic reversal occurs, then we get magnetic dissonance between the sun and the planets. And it could be that because the magnetic fields are misaligned, we could have a process, for example, where the magma inside the Earth starts to get heated up from eddy currents, circulating electric currents inside the Earth. And they may have known that it would take 1,350 years for the pressure inside the Earth to reach a critical value, a critical mass, if you like, before the volcanoes start to explode. And maybe this is the catastrophe they're all warning us about, a secondary effect, a kind of hysteresis, a time delay between the magnetic reversal and actually destruction, which we have yet to ascertain. So we can't, with categoric certainty, say that there won't be catastrophic destruction in 2012. I would say that they were more intelligent than us, and if they warned us about this, which is what they did, they warned us about it in the books of Chile and Balaam, a 16th century document, that's the book of the sun, the book of the jaguar, the yellow sun with the black dots. one of their prophecies says in that book, unattainable is the bread in 2012. The sun shall be eclipsed. Double is the charge. Men will have no children. The chiefs will have no successors, which seems to imply infertility. And they say that for 5 days the sun shall be eclipsed. Then it will be seen again, which seems to suggest a pole tilting or perhaps volcanic eruption, something that will block out the sun. So the prophecies are there, but we haven't got the scientific knowledge to equate with those prophecies at this time.
Maurice, another place where you indicate this knowledge is encoded is a Grail chalice that you describe called the Ardagh chalice. Talk about this chalice for us in the couple minutes we have left, Maurice.
The so-called Ardagh chalice was part of a hall known as the Ardagh chalice after the village where it was found in County Limerick in Ireland in 1868. It's a silver liturgical cup encrusted with gold, bronze and precious glass. And it was found by two men, Jimmy Quinn and Paddy Flanagan, while digging for potatoes. Now, conventional wisdom suggests that the Ardagh chalice was made in 698, and that's because it's engraved with the names of the 12 apostles. Now, the engraving is the same, the style of writing, as is found in the Lindisfarne Gospels, which are known to be dated in AD 698. Now, the Lindisfarne Gospels were written at a monastery of northeast England called Lindisfarne at that time, AD 698, by Irish monks. So clearly, archaeologists have said, look, the writing on this Ardagh chalice is the same style as it is in the Lindisfarne Gospels. Therefore, this Celtic cup must have been written in the late Celtic period, around AD 698, and they placed the cup in the Museum of Dublin, where it rests today. Now, I came along and I said, hang on a second. This book is covered with the super science of the sun, which I've seen in the tombs of Mexico, in Egypt, in Peru. It's got the same information on it. It could never have been made in AD 698, even though the engraving suggests it may have been. Once we start to examine this wonderful chalice, we see that the claims for being, as it was made in AD 698, start to look very shaky. For example, the names of the 12 apostles are engraved on the cup, but one of the names is incorrect. For example, the name of St. Paul appears on the cup. Now, of course, we'd expect the name of Judas to be missing because he betrayed Jesus, but you wouldn't expect the incorrect name of St. Paul to be on the cup. Now, we know today that it was Matthias who became the 12th disciple after he was betrayed by Judas, after Jesus was betrayed by Judas. And we know that because it was written down in the Acts of the Apostles, which is one of the books of the Bible, which was the accepted Bible from about 698, around about the end of the 7th century. Now, if the monks at Lindisfarne who possessed this Bible, the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, knew that Matthias was the one who replaced Jesus, why didn't they carve the name of Matthias on the cup? Why use St. Paul? Now, this is fascinating because St. Paul was the favourite of the Romans during Roman times, and the Romans were in England from about AD 40 to about AD 406 when they left. And St. Patrick, who was a Roman slave, lived in England at that time, and he was sold to landowners in Northwest Ireland. There he lived for about 15 years before he escaped Ireland and went to the monasteries of Lérins and Auxerre in France. He got a ride on a boat. There he studied theology in common with the bishops of England who were also studying at that time. And then in AD 432 he returned to Ireland and converted the Celts to Christianity.
Maurice, it's been a tremendous pleasure to talk with you today. I hope that all the listeners will continue to listen to your conversation with Whitley in the subscriber section, more on this chalice in Ireland and the super science of the gods. Next up, though, is Linda Moulton Howe.
You're about to experience something that you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science, discovery, and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss her website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that tells you the secrets and gives you the facts the others dare not. earthfiles.com. This week, she's reporting on a National Science Foundation report about global warming, plus the plight of the polar bear, plus a knock-your-socks-off report about a horse videotaped, that's right, videotaped floating through the air over Milan, Italy. Now, if you think this is totally crazy, go to earthfiles.com where you will be able to see stills taken from this vivid and extraordinary video. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. On June 22nd this week, the National Academy of Sciences, such an august body, officially reported to Congress a high level of confidence that Earth is the warmest it's been in at least 400 years, and perhaps as far back as 900 AD, more than 1,000 years ago. In its press release, the Academy stated, quote, "There is sufficient evidence from tree rings, boreholes, retreating glaciers, and other proxies of past surface temperatures to say with a high level of confidence that the last few decades of the 20th century were warmer than any comparable period in the last 400 years, unquote. The news release also stated there was less data from the preceding millennia, but there is evidence that several Earth locations were, quote, warmer during the past 25 years than during any other 25-year period since 900 AD, unquote. A top panel of climate scientists produced this National Academy report for the House Science Committee, which last November requested official comment from the National Academy of Sciences about whether global warming is a major threat. Not only did the NAS support the facts of definite global warming from the 20th to the 21st century, the scientific panel concluded that, quote, human activities are responsible for much of the recent warming, unquote. Only 1 week before the National Academy of Sciences report to Congress, 30 climate scientists signed a letter to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service requesting that the polar bear be put on the threatened species list. The polar bear's potential extinction was laid out in their letter this way, quote, as scientists engaged in research on climate change, we are deeply concerned about the effect of Arctic warming on the polar bear habitat. Biologists have determined that sea ice is critical in the life cycle of the polar bear and the survival of the polar bear as a species. Under the Endangered Species Act, the Fish and Wildlife Service is required to list the species for protection if it is in danger of extinction or threatened by possible extinction in all or a significant portion of its range. The ongoing and projected increased loss of sea ice in the warming Arctic poses a significant threat to the polar bear, unquote. The letter from climate scientists to the federal agency also states that the best available observations demonstrate that Arctic warming is rapid, persistent, and widespread, and that only a reduction in human-caused greenhouse gas emissions can prevent further Arctic warming and sea ice melting. This week, I talked about the unthinkable but possible extinction of polar bears with a Canadian zoologist who has studied the magnificent animals since 1984. He is Andrew Desrochers, Ph.D. and Professor of Biological Sciences in the Biological Sciences Center at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada.
The problem is that the bears rely on finding that ice as they migrate northward, as the ice starts to melt, And of course, if they keep moving northward and the ice keeps melting, eventually we're going to see probably more of these drowning events. That would be one of the major concerns. But a lot of the impacts are much more insidious and difficult to monitor. You have to think that if the sea ice is retreating distances of several hundred miles or kilometers over time, that we're asking the bears to walk longer and longer distances in a given year to get to areas where they can make a living and to hunt seals successfully. And if you're using your energy to walk, you can't use that energy to reproduce. And this is where we think that some of the more subtle effects are coming in with decreased recruitment into the populations.
Would that explain also why the polar bears might even be seeking each other out in cannibalism in order to eat?
Well, we have seen cannibalism in polar bears before. It's an uncommon event, and it appears that there are some individuals that when they become desperate, and these individuals are usually large adult males, they become desperate and will start to prey on their own species. It's not common. What's really unusual about the most recent findings is that this population has been studied in Canada and Alaska for over 30 years at differing intensities over time, and nothing like this has ever been seen before. And then all of a sudden in 1 year to see 3 events like this is a concern. We did find another example of this when I was out this last spring as well. So now we're looking at 4 cases in a relatively small period of time. It's a concern because normally when we think about bears killing other bears, the normal pattern is that males will sometimes try to kill the offspring of a female so that they can get a reproductive opportunity with the mother. In this case, what's actually happening is that the bears are killing the adult females and then subsequently consuming them, and that's the great concern for us because anything that alters the survival rates of adult females very quickly changes the population trajectory. So what we're talking about is the population decline that's mediated by cannibalism. We don't know how extensive this is, but when you look at the size of the area that this population is covering and the chances of actually even finding these events is pretty uncommon. So we're pretty certain that there's probably many more instances that are going undetected out there. My guess is that if polar bears are going to persist, it's going to be in the very high latitudes in the Canadian archipelago and perhaps in the very northernmost reaches of Greenland, where even the most pessimistic models for sea ice predict that we'll still have annual ice forming at very high latitudes. So that's going to still provide some habitat for polar bears. The problem is trying to determine how much of that's going to exist and whether or not it will still be adequate for maintaining populations of seals upon which the polar bears rely.
What is your speculation about whether the last polar bear will die and we will truly have seen this great species go into extinction in this century?
I guess I just refuse to believe that humans could be so insensitive to the global conditions that we won't find a solution. I have to confess that, day to day, polar bears are what I study and research and have worked with for many years now. And the concept that they could go extinct through lack of action on a global basis is just too depressing to actually sort of fathom. I'm hoping that technology and a political will come forward and create solutions that will reduce the global warming patterns that we're seeing. And I hope that it's in time. I think that it would be very difficult to maintain a research program and perspective in the long term if I thought that they would actually go extinct. I just find that too depressing to fathom.
But if the Earth doesn't get its act together on CO2 and methane emissions, on the other side of what you just said is polar bear extinction.
I think that's quite likely so. I think that it depends really on which of the various climate warming scenarios actually come to pass. And we know that certainly high latitude areas are warming faster than mid-latitude areas. And the ice scientists are clearly indicating that major changes are coming. They have already occurred. We know that. And it really depends on just what level of climate warming we actually end up seeing and whether or not humans can stabilize greenhouse gases to at least moderate some of the warming patterns and perhaps stabilize at a level that would allow polar bears to persist.
While scientists are trying to save polar bears and other animals faced with hardship and extinctions as planet Earth continues to warm up this century, another kind of animal threat continues to happen around the world without comment. from scientists or political leaders. Law enforcement call that threat animal mutilation. The bloodless, trackless deaths have occurred among horses, cattle, sheep, goats, domestic cats and dogs, and wild animals around the world since at least the early 1960s. Long associated with the strange animal mutilations have been eyewitness sightings of beams of light coming from unidentified aerial discs in the sky. I have interviewed about a dozen ranchers and other eyewitnesses who have seen animals either raised up from pastures in light beams or lowered back dead and mutilated. What is that powerful beam technology? And who or what focuses the beams on animals and even sometimes people? Military and intelligence insiders have said the perpetrators are extraterrestrial biological entities. If so, was it an extraterrestrial beam that lifted a brown horse in the air near a Milan, Italy apartment building and kept the horse suspended about 100 feet off the ground? Or was it a balloon hoax? The incident goes back 8 months ago to October 17, 2005 at 5:07 p.m. The exact time and date were recorded on 3 minutes of digital videotape taken by a Milanese fashion designer named Antonio Ursi. He was on a 6th-floor apartment balcony. His girlfriend, Simona Sibilla, called him excitedly to get to the balcony to see a flying horse in the sky. And Simona was called to the balcony by her young sister, who first cried out that a horse was flying in the sky. Antonio Ursi and Simona Sibilla are both in their late 20s and are successful professionals in Milan's active fashion industry. The unmarried couple has lived together in the same Milan apartment for the past 5 years, and both say they have seen strange phenomena since they were young, but they don't know why. However, each thought that the horse suspended in midair might mean another intelligence out there wants people to know that a large horse can be lifted and held high in the air. The couple wonders if the implication of the flying horse is that something wants the human species to be better prepared to see such events on a more frequent basis. In March of this year, the couple met Mexico investigative journalist and TV producer Jaime Maussan in Italy. They showed Jaime the videotape. He asked for a copy to study back at his offices in Mexico City and called me to say that what he was seeing on the tape reminded him of my animal mutilation investigative reports about eyewitnesses who have described animals rising in beams of light. Jaime sent me a dub of the 3-minute videotape that Antonio Ursi shot from his 6th-floor balcony in Milan. Unfortunately, because Antonio did not put the camera on a tripod, the lens is constantly moving, and most of the individual single video frames do not show a well-focused horse. But Jaime sent me 2 frames from the videotape that are right now at my news website, www.earthfiles.com, and they do show a horse. It's up in the air, and in the foreground of one, you can see towers and antenna out in front of the apartment building in Milan. The second frame is zoomed in more and shows the silhouette of a horse seemingly tipped up higher from the other frame. In the first minute or so of the videotape, the sun does, for a moment, reflect off what seems to be an actual horse in the sky for a couple of seconds, and the horse's hair is a brownish red. This week, after screening the videotape several times, I called Jaime Maussan for an interview about what he has learned from the couple so far and how he plans to investigate further.
They said that the first who saw this object or horse was a little girl, the sister of Simona. And she was very excited, saying that a horse was flying, and Simona came out to the balcony. She saw something, but she didn't understand what she was seeing. She didn't know if this was a helicopter, a UFO, or what. stayed there for 4 or 5 minutes, she realized it was a horse. At that moment, she went inside and called Antonio Ursi, who came and saw the horse for 2 or 3 minutes before he went inside to take his video camera and record what he was seeing. You can hear in the video the voices of Simona and Antonio talking about a flying horse, caballo volador. Antonio, as he told me in the interview, he knows about horses, and he was able to see the horse very close from him. And he saw some signs that, for him, demonstrated that the horse was very tense, like the ears very pointing to the front, the neck very tight. He saw the legs moving, and he realized that this horse was alive. That's when he decided that he had to record this. The duration of the tape tells us that it was somehow brief, but at the same time long enough to see the perfect form of a very big horse. The color is brown. That's what I know about what they said about the incident. They are absolutely convinced that this event happened as a demonstration of the beings that are somehow showing them the UFOs very, very close to them. They believe this is a demonstration. They don't understand exactly why, but that's what they believe.
Could the little girl or the couple ever see anything that might be a beam holding that horse in the air?
No, they just saw the horse flying. They never saw some kind of craft or anything. They just saw this horse moving.
In the videotape, you cannot really see motion of the horse itself as Antonio is describing. And what I'm curious about is what did happen to that horse? Why did Antonio stop videotaping?
That question I don't know for sure. I wonder too, but it seems that the horse, as we see in the end of the tape, is going away, and you can see the horse is very little when we had the last moment of the shot. Mm-hmm. In my opinion, the horse is really moving.
Well, in terms of eyewitness descriptions in interviews with me over the last 3 decades, when people have seen animals rise in these beams of light, the animals usually aren't moving. It is as if whatever the beam technology is somehow paralyzes or holds in place people or animals.
Yeah, well, I don't know if they were carrying this horse with a beam or what, but we don't see the beam and we don't see the crab.
In these last 8 months, since October 17th, 2005 at 5:07 p.m., which is on that videotape when they were videotaping, have they seen anything at all really unusual in the last 8 months near their apartment in Milan?
Yes, they have continued recording. They send me some images. I don't have the video until I go to Milan of what it looks like some kind of robot or humanoid flying very close to them. The images are really startling, but they are just still images. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen the video of this thing flying. And as they email me, they have new events happening very close to them. It's very important for me that you see the other videos that they have recorded, because some of them are the best I have ever seen regarding UFOs. For that reason, I truly believe that this couple is living a very particular experience, like we are having not just one contactee, but 2 contactees. But they are not claiming that they have received messages or that they have communication. Mm-hmm. All they say is that they have experiences. And Antonio Ursi claimed that when he is going to have an important event or when something is going to happen in the sky, he feels it in the chest. Mm-hmm. When he feels that sensation, he takes the camera and he goes out and he sees the crab. That didn't happen with the horse. With the horse, he didn't feel anything. He came out because Sibila was calling him. It seems that there are many witnesses around Milan regarding these events. Many of the witnesses are policemen, and that's very interesting. Another very important thing regarding the video of the horse is that Antonio tried to investigate around the area where he lives if somebody had lost a horse, and he couldn't find anybody who had lost a horse. They looked to me very honest, very sincere. They didn't ask anything for their videos. They said I should copyright the videos and give any money to the children of Giorgio, because as you know, Giorgio is feeding more than 2,000 kids every day in Uruguay and Argentina.
Right.
And they gave the rights to all of their material to the Giorgio boys. For me, that looked very nice, and it proved that they don't want money, they don't want fame, even though he is a designer, a clothes designer, a fashion designer, and she is also a designer and a model. I have to say that she is a very beautiful woman, and he is a very young man, handsome. They are a very handsome couple, as I could say. They live very well. They are very successful. They are really professional. I don't find any single reason to believe that they are trying to hoax something. They are trying to lie about this. All they want is that the case is known around the world. They are not afraid of anything. They are not afraid of criticism. They don't care about criticism. And they are willing to confront anything because they really believe that the experience is important and it's absolutely real.
Can you tell us what it is that you plan to do in Mexico City in July to try to answer the criticism that this might be somebody's hoax with a balloon shaped like a horse?
We are going to create a horse, and we are going to try to make it fly exactly the same way in the video. And we will also take small balloons, the shape of a horse, to see how they fly. I promise we will do our best to try to really replicate, to find the real answers. And if what happened in Milan is really extraordinary, or is something that we could easily explain.
In addition to his experiment with trying to have a balloon manufacturer in Mexico City create a horse approximately full-sized and fly it in the air and see how it compares to the videotape, Jaime plans to return to Milan in September, and the couple has over 100 videotapes that they say that they have taken from that balcony of unusual objects in the sky that they want Jaime to take to whoever, they said any investigator, any researcher. They just know that for some reason they seem to be the focus of something that comes in the sky around their apartment in Milan. They don't understand it, but they feel that they need to share what's happening with the general public.
Well, thank you very much, Linda Moulton Howe. Next week, Robert Temple, Oracles of the Dead.
Our civilization is at a crossroads. We are an unknown country, and something very significant and even wonderful appears to be on the verge of manifesting. Is this a view that you share?
Well, it's difficult to see the wood for the trees sometimes, William, in any situation. And there is no conclusive data right now, for example, that we are nearing any catastrophic period such as has been recorded geologically and in other ways in the past. Clearly, there are prophecies from ancient sun-worshipping civilizations like the Mayas and many of the other sun-worshipping civilizations that I've studied. For example, that of Tutankhamun in Egypt, that was a sun-worshipping civilization. The Viracochas in Peru, again, they worship the sun. The ancient Chinese of the first emperor, around the time of the first emperor, about 220 BC, he too worshipped the sun. And of course, the Celtic people, they were sun worshippers. And what I've discovered during my research is that each of these civilizations understood what I call the super science of the sun, that is, how the sun affects life on Earth. And they went beyond the scientific understanding into a spiritual understanding, which really transcended our own understanding of life today. It was, for example, people have said to me very often, is there a catastrophe forecast in the near future which is going to bring doom to the Earth? And if there is, why didn't the Mayans, for example, try to stop it or escape or whatever? And I tried to explain to them that they realize the higher orders of spirituality, that is, that this life is only transient and brief, these 70 years that we experience here, and that the next life could be everlasting, and there was no point in trying to escape it, because this is such a small part of existence. What is really important is what comes after, not any possible physical catastrophe that might befall mankind in the near future. So, as for the actual question of can we predict anything in the near future, clearly no. But catastrophes have happened in the past. They are recorded in the tree rings of trees, the bristlecone pine, for example, which absorbs carbon-14 over cyclical periods. We know that catastrophes and mini ice ages have frequented Earth. It looks like the Earth has tilted on its planet in the past. Again, all due to solar variations in the solar radiation coming off the sun. And this is why these ancient sun-worshipping civilizations worship the sun, because they understood the profound effect the sun plays in our everyday lives. For example, they knew that the sun spins on its axis every 28 days, and that this radiation travels to the Earth, bombards the Van Allen belts that surround us and protect the Earth from radiation, and convert the particle bombardment into a magnetic variations on the Earth's surface. And we now know that those magnetic variations affect the hypothalamus and pineal gland in the brain. And in so doing, they affect the production of the timing hormone, melatonin. And that, in turn, affects the production of the follicle-stimulating hormone. And of course, estrogen and progesterone, the fertility hormones. And so we now know that the civilization and that of Tutankhamun. For example, Lord Paykal was known as the feathered snake to his people, ostensibly because the feathered eagle represented the spirit in the heavens, and the snake represented the body on Earth that shed its skin periodically, reincarnated from time to time. And of course, Tutankhamun carried the eagle or the vulture and the snake on his forehead. And as I started to learn more and more about these leaders, they shared an awful lot in common. They both took to the throne at 9 years old. They were both born through an immaculate conception. If we have a look at the treasures from the tombs of these two leaders, we notice that they were born through an immaculate conception. That when they lived, they performed miracles, and when they died, they became the planet Venus. Now, planet Venus, from all ancient sun-worshipping civilizations, regarded their leaders as Venus, because it's the brightest, purest source of light in the heavens. So it's associated with spiritual leadership. And the more I looked into the sun-worshipping civilizations, it became clear that each of the world's religions was started by what I call a super god, somebody who understood the super science of the sun and the higher orders of spirituality. And they periodically come to Earth. And the story is the same every time. They're born, when they're born, a bright star is seen in the sky. They're born through an immaculate conception. When they're alive, they perform miracles. When they die, they go to heaven and become the planet Venus. And when I looked at the civilizations of Peru and China and even the Celtic people, the same story comes through every time.
Energy. Life is the interaction of magnetic vibrational fields that run through everything. Earth has a magnetic field, so does the human body. Change the magnetism in one and you change the nature of the energy field. Change the energy field and you change the nature of mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical life, all of which energy in different forms and may even be dimensions. The research of today's guest, Maurice Cotterell, established that the sun is the great mediator of life on the Earth grid and our planet's magnetic field. Is it our great initiator? Maurice has made a long and detailed study of sunspot and solar flare activity when the sun is projecting immensely powerful magnetic energy. This has been photographed as gigantic loops of fire, some 100,000 miles high. This energy travels to the Earth on the solar wind, and it can affect computer systems and cause power blackouts and give you a really bad hair day. But for the Van Allen belts, the zones of radiation that surround and protect our planet and connect with the Earth's magnetic field, the sun's energy would literally fry us. In his latest book, Jesus, King Arthur, and the Journey of the Grail, Maurice has discovered that the super science of the sun and the higher orders of spirituality are concealed and contained in the story of the Holy Grail. Did the Grail stories leave a cryptic message to warn us of a future solar event, a catastrophe when energy surges hit the Earth and pile drive our planet? Do the Grail stories point toward the means to elevate our consciousness, to a means to serve or surf the sun? Just who or what does the Grail serve? Let's ask Maurice Cotterell. Maurice, welcome to Dreamland. Okay. You know, one of the main subjects that we discuss here on Dreamland is change, and it appears
28-day spinning sun regulates the menstrual cycle in females. Now, ancient civilizations understood this process thousands of years ago, and this demonstrates just how far advanced they were then to what we are today. And this is just one effect of solar radiation. There are many other effects of solar radiation, from causing cancer to causing spontaneous fetal abortion and miscarriage. When we have sunspot maximums, periods of high sunspot activity on the solar surface. Pole tilts, if the sun's magnetic field twists and changes direction, it can tilt the planets in our solar system off their axes. And again, all of this knowledge was known by these ancient civilizations. And as you know, I've written a series of books over the years which looked at the Mayan civilization first. That was in 1995. Then the super gods in 1997. Now, this was a little bit of a departure from the actual looking at how the sun affected Earth. When I was working on the Mayan prophecies in 1995, I came to the conclusion that this civilization must have had either a super teacher from whom they received all of their super knowledge, or there was some other mechanism whereby they could have absorbed this knowledge which we are only coming to terms with ourselves today. And as I looked into it more and more, it seemed that they did in fact have a super teacher who was known to them as Lord Teikal, a priest-king leader who taught them everything they needed to know. A few years later, when I looked at the Tutankhamun prophecies, the sun-worshipping civilization of Tutankhamun in Egypt, from around 1350 BC, I began to notice similarities between the Mayan civilization